Right, Charles Moscowitz here. My guest is Alex Newman. He's an author. He's a writer for the New American Magazine. Alex, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me, Chuck. Always a pleasure.
Alex, your latest article deals with some of the economic policies and possible ramifications emanating from the pandemic in the United States. Give us a little background and bring us up to where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck, for the opportunity. And so we're doing a special report, a whole special issue in the New American Magazine about coronavirus. And I wrote two articles for that. One is about kind of the deep state's war on economic freedom in response to this pandemic. The other is, some of the potential silver. But on the economic front, I'll tell you, Chuck, I'm extremely concerned about what's happening. You have the largest spending bill in history rushed through without even a recorded vote. And then when Congressman Thomas Massie asked that they at least go on record about who's voting for what so there could be accountability, everybody freaked out, including President Trump, and started attacking him. Mm-hmm. I think that's very, but even more disturbing than that is the $6 trillion once you add in what the Federal Reserve has committed to create. And they're literally creating money out of nothing and using it to buy up real assets. They're using it to perpetuate the bubble in municipal bonds. They're using it to buy up stocks. They're taking equity positions in companies. This is absolutely crazy, Chuck. Then you add to that the move to dethrone the dollar and move to a global currency run by the IMF, the special drawing rights, the move to get rid of cash. The Democrats actually tried to sneak in a digital stimulus bill that would have paid all Americans their stimulus using these digital dollars and digital wallets maintained by the Federal Reserve. You realize that the enemies of freedom are exploiting this crisis to advance their totalitarian and globalist agenda, and it's got me very concerned, Chuck.
Well, yeah, it was like what Rahm Emanuel famously said, that you can't let a good crisis go to waste. And whether or not this is a crisis that was created in a laboratory, these are some things that are starting to come out now. We don't know. But either way, it is a crisis. And the reaction to it is something that almost approximates what communism only could dream of in this country. We've never had a situation where we are literally being shut into our own homes and that you can face penalties, which means you could technically face prison if you violate those ideas. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not talking in the formal sense. I don't want to alarm anyone. But there are a lot of anecdotal things coming out with regard to people being seriously threatened because they're at a supermarket and they coughed or something like that. There was just a minister in Florida who was fined because he held a service. There's Orthodox Jewish synagogues in New York that are being told that they're going to be confiscated if they attend services. Certainly it's an assault on religion, but putting that aside, this is an open and frontal assault on the most basic and fundamental recognized rights in the Constitution. I get the fact that we have a pandemic, and I'm being careful like everyone else. I'm not going outside and hanging around a lot of people right now. And, I'm concerned. It is a disease, and a disease is a disease. But it is setting certain precedents in terms of what we're getting used to and what we're learning, what we're being conditioned to accept. And I think that we're all concerned about getting back to the status quo ante. But yet you're talking here, Alex, about this enormous so-called stimulus, this emergency borrowing, which would never have happened if there wasn't an emergency. And which, I suppose, I've heard some things on the positive side which say that this is going to end the Federal Reserve, because if they drop interest to zero, then basically the U.S. Treasury is merging with the Fed. And this could mean that we'll have what Abraham Lincoln created during the Civil War, greenbacks, monies created on the full faith and credit of the United States that are not loaned at interest by this international cartel of bankers, which is what the Federal Reserve is.
Yeah, I've been hearing that too, Chuck, and I'd like to believe that that was going to be the case, but I'm just not seeing it. What I see is similar to what happened in the 2008 crisis. The Federal Reserve is now setting up these things they call special purpose vehicles, which is just a fancy name for a front company set up by the Federal Reserve. They're working in partnership with the Treasury. But what the Federal Reserve has said is we're going to basically create unlimited liquidity. In other words, they're going to print unlimited money, or at least create it digitally through the computer. And then they're using this to buy up real assets. I mean, they are de facto nationalizing industries, nationalizing countries, companies. And they are perpetuating these unsustainable economic policies. Now, I take a little bit of a different view on the economy. I know a lot of people were thinking the economy was just doing fantastic. I think we never really fixed the problem during the last economic crisis. All they did was just flood the world with funny money and keep interest rates insanely low, which, a number that wasn't justified by market fundamentals, by the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. And they have now created a situation that's just explosive. It's extremely dangerous. Now, you have the government forcibly shutting down the economy. They're openly talking about, as many as 50 million people. The Federal Reserve Board of St. Louis projected that maybe 50 million people, 47 million people, would lose their job. That's about a third of all American workers. They're talking about shaving a third of GDP off of our gross domestic product. This would be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, this would be like, a nuclear bomb attack on some of America's biggest cities. I mean, it would be impossible, I think, to overstate the significance of this. And unfortunately, I think the biggest problem is the government in this case. There's a virus out there, and people ought to take precautions. But shutting down the economy could prove far more destructive than anything that a virus could do. And then you add on top of that, as we were talking about earlier, the destruction of our civil liberty, even our most protected, our most fundamental, our most sacred rights, right? Religious liberty. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That means they're not supposed to be telling churches, yeah, you can or you can't do this. I mean, the government doesn't get to decide when churches and synagogues and things like this meet together. They're talking about restricting freedom of speech. And honestly, they've been planning this for a long time, Chuck. If you go back and look at the Rockefeller Foundation's 2010 report, they envisioned an exercise called Lockstep, where they would basically shut everything down, have the government seize all these new powers that would be kept in perpetuity, issue biometric IDs to everybody, mandatory vaccinations, praise for Communist China's system of government amid these types of times. Now, this is all very, very dangerous, and if we're not careful, we may come out of the other end of this with a whole lot less freedom, a whole lot poorer, and potentially in, kind of like after 9/11, the new normal is fundamentally different from the old normal, and I think that's a very, very serious risk that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, you're drawing some very dire, but yet some very good and well-founded concerns. There's a precedent for the oligarchs, the East, what we used to call the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, the internationalists, the globalists, profiting and consolidating power in advance of, for example, the Great Depression, where they a lot of them consolidated their properties into real estate and objects of art and other things that have intrinsic value, gold, etc. And the same thing happened right before the meltdown, the mortgage meltdown. You had the owners of Wachovia Bank cash in their chips, and other big bankers. I wonder if the same thing isn't happening here, in that you've got people who anticipated this. We already know that there were a couple of congressmen who made a few bucks.
Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah, Feinstein and Burr and a few others, because they were in on meetings and they immediately cashed in their properties. But I'm talking something bigger than that. People who might have had a little premonition about this and who are setting themselves up so that when the market does collapse, if it does, and properties collapse and value collapses, they can walk in and grab up all the bargains and further consolidate their power and wealth.
Yeah, and I think that's a very real situation that we're seeing right now, Chuck. I mean, it's very similar to what happened after the Great Depression. Federal Reserve policies deliberately sucked liquidity out of the economy, caused asset prices to collapse, stock market imploded, mortgages weren't paid, businesses started going bankrupt, and then the people in the know, really the private cartel that owns the Federal Reserve banks, and you can call the Federal Reserve Bank, I mean, you can call the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and they'll tell you we're a private institution. We're owned by
That's
private
right.
shareholders. It's the big banks that own us. They come in then and they pick up these distressed assets at pennies on the dollar. And so we wake up on the other side of this and suddenly they own our houses, they own our buildings, they own our companies, they own our stock market, and we're left holding the debt that they created to buy up all these assets. I like what Thomas Massey said about this. The $1,200 in the stimulus package per individual, that was the cheese in the mousetrap, right? But when you actually look at the numbers, they're talking about $7 per household. And if you're lucky, you might get a couple $1,000s as part of the stimulus. Well, what's happening to the rest? Well, it's going to the mega bankers. It's going to the cronies of the people who own the Federal Reserve. It's going to the big corporations. So they use that little $1,200 as the, they know everybody's freaking out. We're losing our jobs. We're hungry. I don't want my kids to starve. They know we're in a panic. And they put this cheese on the mousetrap. Everybody wants the cheese. And boom, the trap closes. And you end up having a situation where a massive amount of wealth is transferred from the poor and the middle class in America to the elites. It's completely unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. And now we have a situation where, this is much more serious than the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there were at least some legal constraints on the Federal Reserve. And of course, there was at least in theory, the gold constraint, right? They weren't supposed to be printing too much money beyond what they had in gold to back it up because the dollar was still at least ostensibly backed by gold. Now they can print infinite money. And they've told us, they said, we're going to create unlimited liquidity to backstop the markets. I mean, they're telling you they're going to print infinite money. And now they don't even have these constraints. They used to only be able to buy U.S. Treasury securities. Now they can buy anything they want through these special purpose vehicles, including stocks, including bonds, corporate bonds, including municipal bonds. This is a very, very dangerous situation. And, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, Chuck. My other article in the special report that we're doing in the New American is about the potential silver linings, and I think there are some. There are. But the risks are huge. So.
No, they are. And I think that, as I said, regardless of how this thing came about, the longer it lasts, the worse it's going to be. And you have people and I think President Trump is generally on our side on this. And yet you have people who are criticizing him for saying that it's going to be over by Easter. They want it to go longer. You've got Jeffrey Sachs, the CEO, multinational corporation CEO, who's responsible for a lot of very bad stuff all over the world already, saying that he expects the thing to run through till Labor Day. I mean, that, they want to prolong this thing. And every day that it goes on is a day that we're going to get further and further in the hole. Now, you talk about silver linings. I mean, I think on the other hand, the American people have woken up to our tradition and the world tradition of being prepared, of prepping, having enough supplies, enough provisions to last a month to 6 weeks at least in stock. I think that's something that we're going to do going forward and as a response to this crisis. Other things that I think might benefit is homeschooling. People are home. Their kids aren't going to school. The big government schools have been shut down. It's an opportunity by necessity to begin to teach and learn at home, which is going to be, I think it's going to wake up a lot of people. And you already hear cries about this from the establishment that, these big fat institutions, these universities that are putting people hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, do we need them? Can we do this at home? People are spending more time with their children. The other thing is that a lot of people are conducting their business at home. They're doing their job. My wife is an example. She's e-commuting from home, from her computer, and people are realizing, hey, we don't need to go to these big fat offices every day and punch a time clock. We can work from home at least part of the week. And I think that companies are going to realize how much money they could save by not, expanding these big offices. People are going to have more autonomy. In a way, it potentially could be, at least, sociologically, in terms of how society works, because every time there's a crisis, we learn things, that this could be a move back to the way America was at the founding, the agrarian society where people had their farms, they had the small businesses, local manufacturing, a move more toward localism and more self-sufficiency. So these are all, I think, positive things that could come out of this crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on every point there, Chuck. And one of the things that I've found really encouraging is how many people are now finally realizing that no, the government's not going to save you, right? And you're not
That's
even
right.
going to be able to watch your idol, your sports during this crisis. And people are in large numbers turning back to God and praying. There was just a headline today on Drudge. Most Americans are praying during this crisis. And I think that's something we really need. We got so prosperous, we got so fat, happy, and wealthy that we just kind of completely forgot about God and the foundations of why we were so prosperous. These biblical principles, thou shalt not steal, the fundamentals of our free market economy and of our morality. I hope we're going to see kind of a resurrection of those principles and a restoration of the American people's faith. I understand that the numbers of people watching church online now are through the roof. I've got some anecdotal data. I have a family member that works at a drug rehab facility, found out that there's, mass baptisms going on there as people, who are panicked suddenly realize, hey, we got to depend on God here, not big brother government to save us. So that's, I think, really encouraging. And, the education front, too, for me is just such a beautiful silver lining amid this horrifying chaos otherwise, because you have, I think, millions of parents who are going to homeschool and realize, hey, this is awesome. We're getting closer to our kids, our family's getting stronger, the kids are learning, we're having a good time. Yeah, it's a sacrifice, it's a little tough, but hey, this is so much better than what we were doing before. You also have parents in very large numbers who for the first time are going to start seeing what kind of filth and nastiness and dumbed down idiocy their children are being exposed to at these government schools. We actually know each other, Chuck, through our late mutual friend, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. This was his life's passion, was to show parents
I could just hear what he'd be saying now with alpha phonics and bringing back reading and the most basic cognitive skills that we all took for granted and that are now people are turning to. And you're right, people are turning to faith. I mean, there's these massive prayer groups. I saw something about in one case a priest issuing confession in a parking lot of a church, putting on a blindfold, and people driving up and getting confession. Now, those are people who may not otherwise have done this. In my own faith community, you have synagogues who are doing these things with Zoom so that people can join a service from home. You can't do certain things in Judaism unless you have a minyan, which means you need 10 bar mitzvah adult males together in a room in order to perform certain prayers. So, yeah, that can't be done. However, and you can't have a mass either online. But you can, it's bringing people out who otherwise wouldn't have done anything at all and who are joining these Zoom groups. And there are discussions about Torah and there are discussions about the situation in that context that they would never have had before. So, yeah, I mean, there is definitely, I think, from this, at least anecdotally, possibly a revival of faith. And that's another good lining to this whole crisis.
Absolutely. I think this is finally going to shake a lot of Americans out of their complacency when it comes to communist China, too. Communist China, I've been arguing this for years, is a very significant threat to, global peace, liberty around the world on so many fronts. And, we actually had a cover story in the New American last year about the fact that communist China was making 90% of the precursors that we use for our pharmaceuticals, which,
Right.
a lot of Americans depend on these pharmaceuticals to stay alive. It's absolutely crazy. We have a situation where we can't even keep most of our Air Force jets in the sky without communist Chinese parts. And so I think this is a real wake-up call, and I'm very pleased that President Trump has taken this opportunity to start dealing with this. We have got to get off our dependence. If they want to make plastic garbage that they sell at Toys R Us, okay, fine. That's not a strategic. It's not a national security threat. It's not a threat to our health. But we have got to break our dependence on a hostile, mass-murdering communist dictatorship for these crucial things. And I think this may be, the spark that sets off that process to get off that dependence. And I think that's very good. And so, these are all really positive outcomes that we could see. You mentioned people now finally starting to realize that they need to be prepared. Suddenly preppers don't look kooky anymore. Suddenly they look like geniuses. You've got all kinds of first-time gun buyers going out to the gun shops and saying, hey, the government's not going to be there to protect me. I have to protect myself. that's going to be a very positive thing, even after this all calms down. So hopefully there's
Mhm.
going to be a lot of benefits from this. But, on the risk side, we do really have to be careful that we don't surrender liberties. Once we give up liberties, they're not going to give them back to us, without
Right.
a
No, that's
very
right.
serious fight. So.
That's going to be a big one. And Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee actually has a bill right now to reevaluate and to end dependence on China for foreign pharmaceuticals and medical products. I guess China has almost a monopoly, apparently, on masks and hospital preparation, which is woefully short right now. And of course, we found out that it has been short in the government supply since Obama didn't replenish it after the N1 virus. But putting that aside, this, I think, and you might comment on this, Alex, this has a potentially positive effect on awareness on the importance of national sovereignty. And when I say that, people generally understand and praise the fact that President Trump shut the border to China immediately back in January. At the time, he was criticized by the usual establishment. Oh, you got something against Chinese men and women and all that crap. But now, it's recognized. Even Canada has shut their border to the United States. The European Union shut their borders just recently after there's already been 1,000 deaths in Italy. Took that much, but they have finally done that, and they're not responding to this clamor to let Muslim migrants come in from Greek islands, which otherwise they may have done. So you've got an awareness of the importance of national borders. And this is in a crisis, we can see that importance magnified many times over. There's even states that are asserting their borders. Rhode Island is preventing New Yorkers from coming into the state, and they're checking them at the border with patrols. Indiana has shut their border to Michigan. This is something that Florida has shut all their borders. It's a reassertion of sovereignty on a lot of levels, and it's new awareness, hopefully, of the importance of sovereignty and why sovereignty is progressive and important and democratic. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more with you, Chuck. And I think that might be another one of the big, positive outcomes from this. And Pat Buchanan, who's very well known in American politics, he asked whether this was going to be the death of the New World Order. And I don't know if I would go quite that far, but, he's right. Americans now are really realizing the wisdom of putting America first and the wisdom of having secure borders. We don't want just anybody from anywhere coming in unvetted, unchecked, without any kind of health test, without any kind of screening if they're criminals. So I'm hoping this will be a positive outcome. And you're right, at the state level, too, to have different states responding in different ways. We don't all need to have our states just being subservient administrative units or provinces of a centralized regime. And I think in that respect, Trump has done, and I think Trump has done a good job on that. He's been pressured by some of his deep state advisors, some of the swamp creatures, even some of the governors. Oh, you need to, shut down the country and you need to tell everybody what they should be doing. And he said, no, the governors are handling that. We might issue guidelines, recommendations, but we are not an all-powerful dictatorship where one guy makes all the decisions. So I'm hoping that kind of sentiment will last. And I tremble to think what would have happened if we hadn't had President Trump in there.
Oh my God! Thank God for Trump.
I know.
Yeah, can you imagine if there had been a liberal Democrat in there, we would already have had martial law. We would have a complete confiscation of big corporations. In fact, Mayor de Blasio of New York already called for that.
Yeah, shutting down churches and synagogues forever.
Yeah, well, that's right. But he's also called for the nationalization of major industries. There would be concentration camps. I'm sorry, I'm not saying like Hitler's type, but people would be put away in places if they had the disease or if they were violating codes by going out to a supermarket and sneezing or whatever. I'm just saying that this is thank God for Trump. He's been pretty steady in terms of exercising power moderately when possible. We are worried about, as your article says, extra governmental institutions like the Federal Reserve, which has a monopoly control of the value of our currency. That is a big problem. But there very well may be a way to address that as well as we go. These are dangerous times. Alex Newman, I'm glad that you're shining a light on these issues. It's going to become critical, that you do so, that we all do so in the coming days and weeks. And hopefully it won't be too long before this thing is over. What do you think?
Yeah, I hope it's going to end soon. I was really pleased that Donald Trump is, trying to keep people, give them hope that, at some point soon, hopefully this will be ending and we'll get back to normal. I think it's very important. And, thank you for having me on, Chuck. I think
Thank
this is a
you.
really important discussion. I hope the viewers will share this. We've got a lot of information over at thenewamerican.com if people want to stay up to date without the, CNN fake news hysteria. We'll send you the information that's important,
Yeah.
that's vetted, that's accurate, so you can make good decisions during these times. And, thanks again, Chuck, for having me. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate very much what you do. So
Thank you, Alex. And let's talk soon. Let's stay in touch and do it from time to time.
excellent. I'd love to. Thank you so much, Chuck.
All right. Thank you.